Welcome to the IFA's post-15th Global Conference on Aging Thematic Discussions Among Experts, the final webinar in this four-part series. Today's discussion focuses on the theme of ageism, more specifically, addressing structural ageism to unlock a longevity economy. A reminder, this webinar is recorded and streamed live on the IFA Facebook page. Today's webinar begins with remarks from 3 expert speakers, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. Please use the Q&A function along the bottom of your screen to pose any questions or post comments for today's speakers and any relevant resources in the chat. Dr. Jane Barrett, our moderator for today, will read them out to the speakers during the moderated discussion. Any relevant resources, as well as the recordings of the webinars in the series, will be shared in the upcoming IFA Voltage e-newsletter and on the IFA website. It is now my pleasure to pass the floor to the Secretary General of the IFA, Dr. Jane Barrett.
Thank you very much, Andra. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to delegates around the world. The International Federation on Aging has a unique relationship with AARP. In fact, at the very early ages of the IFA, we were almost belonging to and part of the AARP. And so that's why it makes these 4 webinars that we've been partnering with AARP to develop so important and so unique. So once again, thank you to AARP for your leadership domestically, but internationally. You know, we respect and acknowledge our history with you and the strength of our relationship going forward. As Andra said, you know, there was exceptional presentations across the IFA's 15th Global Conference that was held in November in Niagara. And because of that, we wanted to highlight some very important topics. You know, the conference was built around 4 main action areas of the decade: long-term care, ageism, primary integrated care, and age-friendly environments. And so today we come to our 4th and final webinar with 3 eminent speakers. Each speaker will have, you know, about 10 minutes to present their case, their information, and then throughout this webinar, I'll be asking them those questions that we would rather put to one side. So join us in asking the tough questions of these experts today. Firstly, I want to thank Patrick Swain, who stepped in at the very last minute. Patrick, thank you very much for being ready and committed to this webinar. Patrick joined the International Longevity Centre just in August 2020 and has previous work experience in public policy and global affairs. Prior to ILC, Patrick worked as research assistant for the Centre for Entrepreneurs, where he co-authored several research reports, including the Global Refugee Entrepreneurship Survey 2019. This was a worldwide survey that highlighted the social and economic impacts and benefits of providing refugees with tailored business support programs. He also helped conduct a large-scale analysis of companies' health data to identify the number of new UK businesses created in 2019, helping to inform journalists and policymakers about the UK's economic input and output and entrepreneurial creativity. Patrick comes to this position with lengthy experience, but just prior to this webinar, he was really talking with us about his work in the area of vaccination. So today we're asking him to talk about, you know, understanding and addressing structural ageism and certainly the longevity dividend. So the floor is yours, Patrick.
Jane, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone joining us today. This is a very interesting discussion topic, and one that the International Longevity Centre UK is very interested in. Just a bit of background about the ILC UK. So we are one of 16 members of the ILC Global Alliance. At ILC, we are committed to finding out more about longevity and ageing in society and the impact it's going to have on everything from the economy to pensions, right through to things such as ageism. And we're really keen to find out what happens next. as at the core of our organisation. So what is it about ageism that we're interested in, and what do we believe is kind of key to unlocking that global longevity dividend? Well, for us, we see it as two things. We see ageism as something being internalised and externalised. So internalised ageism is that thing where people have a view of themselves when they get older, and they think into themselves that I can't do this because I'm getting old. This isn't right for me because of my age. And it's something that's really, really important to not think about when you're aging. We shouldn't really be thinking like that internally. We should be thinking more positively about ourselves as individuals and the capabilities that we have, whatever age we are. And then that externalized ageism is obviously another thing that we've covered as well, especially in the workplace, where people are discriminated against because they are deemed not fit enough to do a job, they're too old, and they're not there fit for purpose. So for us, we don't see age as a barrier. We believe that it shouldn't be a barrier, but in order to unlock the longevity dividends, people need to be in good health, and they need to have a good understanding of that the age is not something that can limit them. So we know that people aged 50 and over, and $1 in every $3 across the G20 in 2014. And by 2040, this is projected to be 40%. So 2 in 5 people over the age of 50 projected to be the key earners across the G20. So that's a massive economic opportunity. And we really see that people who are 50 plus, they are actually the key to the future of the economy. And when you look globally as well, in countries such as places like Japan, this is even more pressing. This is going to be a bigger number with their aging population, but certainly in Europe as well, we're seeing this. It's a rising aging demographic, and we need to kind of ensure that the foundations of the economy are there in order to support older workers. And ageism is a big part of that. If you think about it, people, as they get older, they do face more discrimination because of who they are as a person, because of their age. And employers and older workers too often see training and professional development as more relevant for younger people, which leads to missed opportunities for enhancing skills and sharing that experience. As the risk of developing an impairment increases with age, occupational health support is key, with ongoing support that acknowledges the social model of disability. So we really, when we say that, we're saying that people need to really understand that they, ageism isn't something that should be in the workplace. It shouldn't be something that is considered as a barrier, and you should have the relevant training and necessary skills to help people, and that can really unlock a lot of the potentials for a longevity economy. And within that, actually, it's not just about working. We're also seeing a lot of people who are of a certain age who are beneficial through other means, so volunteering or grandparenting. So older people provide a lot more economic value than we think. And it's not just, we get old, we retire, we go on our saga cruises, and that's it. We're actually seeing that people over the age of 50, over the age of 65, if they're in good health and they're able to, then they are able to support the economy. And one of the key things actually I focus on a lot at ILC and through my work with the Coalition for Life Course Immunisation is vaccination. Moving maybe a little bit away from ageism here, but it's about life course immunisation being an important tool to help people and to help the economy. So older adults who are vaccinated are more likely to be in better health by having a stronger immunity against the vaccine preventable diseases that are kind of more likely to disrupt their later health and later life. And our motto really is from all of this is health equals wealth. You know, if you're in good health, you're able to support the economy, you're able to volunteer, you're able to, live your life to the full without age being a barrier. I guess wrapping things up a bit now, we see the need to invest in prevention heavily in order to achieve this as well. So whilst ageism is also one barrier, we also see health prevention as something that is really, really key to ensuring that older people can contribute. So that is why at ILC, we're urging governments across the G20, but also globally, to invest at least 6% of their health budgets in prevention. And obviously IFA is based in Canada, I believe, where there is, a government there that does invest 6%, at least 6% in its prevention programs, preventative health programs. And prevention can be anything from vaccination to cancer screening. But also really, I think prevention actually, we need to prevent ageism as well in order to, really fulfill and make the most out of people at later life and ensure that they can contribute to the economy. So I think there's a lot of social aspects as well as the health aspects, but certainly at ILC, we see them both going hand in hand to ensure that internalized and externalized ageism doesn't become a barrier for people at later life.
Look, thank you very much, Patrick, for those viewpoints. I do want to come back to you on a couple of things, and just to agree to disagree on a couple of things. Age actually is a barrier, because if we actually look at what's happened during this pandemic, those that, if we just look in Canada, for example, 80% of deaths were those people in long-term care. And it wasn't only age, but it was the situation living in long-term care. So when we look at the WHO's global report on ageism, the three, types of ageism: personal, as you said, the internal, the interpersonal, but also the institutional. And so I think that, you've touched on, workplace, you've touched on health, but in fact, millions of older people actually are prevented through ageism in not being able to access the very basic screenings to, eye health, to hearing. And that then flips into your conversation about health equals wealth. And what we're really talking about here is the functional ability of an older person, to then be in a position to contribute, but also not only economically, but also socially. So did you want to make a comment about that?
Yeah, of course. No, of course, age is a barrier, but I'm saying age shouldn't prevent people from contributing at later life. And in order to achieve that, obviously, like you say, they need to be in good health, but also the structural barriers, as you mentioned there, do need to come down. We need to ensure that people are given opportunity and that they're recognised as a person, not as just an older person or an elderly person, which is a term we do not like at ILC for sure. So yeah, by all means, that is a very important thing to recognise. And certainly when it comes to stuff like vaccine preventable diseases, the disproportionality between younger and older people, things like COVID-19, that's obviously had a far bigger impact on older people. And that is why vaccination programs have obviously been scheduled to ensure that older persons get the vaccine first, followed by other people in other generations. But certainly I think the structural barriers within society do mean that there's a lot of ageism. I think there's a lot of misconceptions as well, which really don't help. We've recognised a lot of these at ILC as well. Everything from marketing to advertisement, for example, where people play on these stereotypes and tropes of older people or have these misconceptions and misunderstandings of what an older person is, it's only reinforcing that narrative. And until we remove those, that's only when we can really fully unlock this idea of a longevity economy and recognise that older people actually, they're not just grey-haired and like their saga cruises and they're all the same people. This isn't a homogenous group. This is a group of a big span with many different needs and many different capabilities, and we need to really recognise the value of all older people.
Look, thank you for that, and of course we need to value people of all ages, and I certainly wouldn't hold Canada up as the gold standard when it comes to percentage of GDP dedicated to health promotion prevention. What we really need to be understanding is how to reorientate the current healthcare systems, away from sickness and ill health to prevention. But that's certainly going to need, tremendous investment. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Patrick, but we'll come back to you in the moderated discussion. So don't leave us. AARP is one of those institutions around the world that develops programs and policies based on evidence. This is one of the finest organisations in the development of policy and also in advocacy and influencing policy based on evidence. And so, from time to time, more often than not, I turn to AARP and the knowledge assets that have been created. And I know that Sarah Lenz-Locke just last week, in talking about cognitive reserve and brain health, I just want everybody to recall, the very important tools that the Global Brain Institute, I hope I've got that word right, of AARP has developed. And so perhaps, Andra, at the same time as we move on to listen to Dr. Irwin Tan, you could populate that resource, because I think it's a very important resource. I love your title, Irwin, and when I go into my next job, I want to be called the Director of Thought Leadership. And you are a physician with fellowship training in geriatric medicine and integrative medicine. Your current focus at AARP is healthy longevity, and you are a tactical lead in the cross-enterprise disparities strategy. You've previously served as the Director of Senior Corps, now America Corps Senior, at the Corporation for National and Community Service. And from a 6-year period from 2004 to 2010, you also served as Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where you were an attending physician in the Division of Geriatric Medicine. You have a number of other positions that I just want to touch on briefly. And I do that because, it seems really interesting to me, the career paths of our experts. You have also, in your career, a White House Fellow, serving as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And before coming to Washington, D.C., you were a faculty member at the University of California, served as Geriatric Medicine Fellow and a Primary Care Medicine resident. It strikes me, Irwin, that perhaps you're much older than what you really are with that kind of career. But I want you to really talk with us about what you're seeing in terms of the strategic development of addressing structural ageism and some of the work that AARP has undertaken in the past, and how that can be used to inform not only US policy, but much more broadly globally. So thank you very much for being with us and for having the title of Director of Thought Leadership.
Thank you, Jane. One of my classmates from undergrad now is the Director of Dinosauria, Smithsonian Museums. I think that is still the best title I've ever heard. So I love this conversation about the definitions of ageism: internal, interpersonal, and structural. And much of the work that we've been doing at AARP is really led by our CEO, who wrote this book called Disrupt Aging. And she likes to say 50 is the new 50. And to expound on, Jane, some of your comments, 25 is the new 25, 75 is the new 75. And that's the way we like to look at it across the generation, looking at people's different lifespans. And when I was a younger person, it was the right time for me to move across the country and be a White House Fellow now I'm 52, and it's the right age for me to be a parent with more patience for my children, and I think that's what we're really trying to say, is that 52 is a real number, right? It's my age. There, it affects how I view my horizons, what I want to do for the next, 48 years if I live to 100, and it affects my medical decisions as well. But it's the other 52, how the world perceives me and myself in terms of being a 52-year-old, and the other demographic characteristics I have that I think AARP is very interested in as well, because one's own perceptions of one's aging seems to be a predictor of one's health and longevity, and some of the behaviors that we can choose to do. Some of the great work has been by Becca Levy, who I think is coming out with a new book. She's from Yale University, a professor of psychology, and some of her earlier work showed that if you had a positive perception of your own aging, you tended to live 7.5 years longer than someone with a lower perception of one's aging. And over this 18-year span, you tended to have a higher functional status. And so why is that? Part of it may be that the human mind is a great integrator of a lot of soft data. How old am I now? How old did my parents live? How old were my neighbors when they passed away? Thinking about that and realizing that one's zip code, where one was born and where one lives at age 50, thinking about ARP research, is a predictor of one's longevity. That may be part of it. But there's some other data that suggests that perception of one's aging also affects one's decisions. There's additional research coming out of University of Michigan that shows that it affects what your preventive healthcare choices, right? Are you gonna, and also your health-related behaviors. If you believe that you will be living longer, you might want to act a certain way that supports health and longevity over a lifetime. And there's also additional evidence to suggest that this perception of aging seems to be a robust finding in terms of it. There was initial research that was conducted with the National Institute of Aging, part of the NIH in the United States, that looked at people with different levels, different variants of ApoE protein. ApoE protein, the various variants can be associated with your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And what they found is that people with positive variants and people with negative variants obviously were at different rates of eventually progressing to cognitive impairment. But even in that variation, one's self-perception of aging also influenced the outcome as well. So it may be that there is both an interaction, like in so many things, between your personal risk factors and your environment and your personal psychology. Because when we say things are just in our head, well, our head is a real thing, right? Like those are our thoughts, our feelings, those are actual, somehow being I don't want to be totally, someone who's a reductionist, but those represent chemical reactions and pathways that exist in our brain. And so that's an important piece to consider. So what do we do about it? We've talked about this internal racism, and it seems to be important in predicting one's health. There's another piece called Stereotype Threat, and Stereotype Threat was first described often in education at people's younger age, where people were given tests and told that their particular demographic group didn't tend to do as well, or in those tests, their performance was worse. And this could be done and replicated in sort of psychological experiments. And Beck Levy also did some initial tests where people were subjected to sort of subliminal, like very rapid perceptions, positive, negative, of aging, right? So these are images that occur at a subconscious level, typically illegal in advertising. But what was shown is that having this exposure could actually influence your performance on a standard lower extremity test. Get up and go, turning around, your gait, speed. So again, it's this interpersonal external racism that affects performance. And why is that? There are, again, a lot of theories. One theory is that it seems to be affecting your frontal cortex, your executive function, that if you don't feel comfortable, like personal speaking, like the situation, Jane, that you've put me in today, speaking in front of an audience, it's anxiety provoking, right? And I'm not feeling at the top of my game. I might be second guessing myself. I might have a slight stutter. I might pause. I might not be able to form those immediate relationships between ideas. And that's, I think, what's occurring with this idea of stereotype threat. But there are many other theories. So again, one of the fun things about my career, and sort of the varied career I've had, is that at ARP, I've been able to partner with some really fun organizations, and now with the IFA. So I represent ARP on the Aging Disability Independence Forum for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And we did this great workshop. It was about the perceptions of aging and disability and its impact on health. And we held it at the Parsons School Design Fashion School. So you can imagine the headline, ARP, Parsons School Design Fashion School, and the National Academies of Science, Education, and Medicine. It was fantastic. And why did we hold it at the fashion school? Well, one of the formative things that are not on my resume is that I was a big fan of this show called Project Runway, right? And it was this reality show where you ask these people to, at the very last moment, So like Patrick produced this piece of work, but in this case it was like a piece of fashion. And one of the great lines from that was that fashion should make you feel good about yourself. Well, if you think about the modern fashion industry, the people who can afford the high-end fashion can't necessarily fit into it, and the people who can fit into it can't necessarily afford it. And yet, why does this exist? Maybe it's that with all these insecurities that develop, one is then predisposed to spend money on things that alleviate one's insecurities. I think what we're talking though about at the fashion school is how we can create products that allow people to feel good about themselves and what inspired people. One of the things I think that in our pre-conversation we talked about is this idea of the intergenerational experience, right? Like my own experience, I'll mention Experience Corps, placing older adult volunteers in the Baltimore City public school system, and we studied their health benefits, the health benefits of volunteering. Here it was, this idea of haute couture, so like producing individualized content. A lot of the students were producing material for their loved ones, for a loved one who had peritoneal dialysis, who needed access regularly to their shunt, or a person who was in a wheelchair and wanted a shirt that was shorter in front than in the back. So like the idea behind clothing that cyclists use, right? And it was all about making people feel good about themselves through fashion. And then we had panels that talked about the arts and theater, representation of theater, and I think that's all very important. That's one of the strategies we can do to affect all these forms of ageism, including the one's perceptions of oneself. And I'm going to just pause there and head over to my colleague. And there's a lot we could talk about, but I'll leave it with this.
So, Erwin, just before we head over to Peter, I just wanted to go back, to a couple of things that you said. And I think they're really, they're new in my way of thinking. And it's how the world perceives me is important at some physical, psychological, emotional level to me. It touches me somehow. And I thought the statement about, the human mind integrates data, and that data can be the environment, it can be something someone said, it can be a noise, it can be, so all the time the mind is integrating and filtering, intelligence that comes in, and that may be physically, emotionally, psychological, but the brain is doing that. I think, stereotype threat, I think, has a relationship also to brain health, because I know, Sarah was talking about, there are some modifiable factors, aren't there, around cognition and cognitive reserve. And I want to be able to understand, this stereotype threat, and I agree with you, that 7 years, that, 7 additional years per se, if someone is speaking positively and thinking positively. So is there some kind of relationship that we can make between the stereotypical threat and brain health and functioning? I know it's a big...
No, I think it occurred at several different levels. I think this idea of chronic stress, right? This idea that, constantly thinking that there are cave bears in the room with you, right? This is a very archaic fight or flight syndrome that we often experience. We talk about weathering as being one of the fundamental ways in which racism affects and creates health disparities, is that even if one compensates and is able to be highly functioning in a situation where there's a lot of systemic inequalities, that causes an effect on the person, that maintain that homeostatic situation is very stressful, and that's part of it. As an aside, if anyone has seen Cars 3, there's a great little scene where the main character, Lightning McQueen, is now an older car, as it were, and not sure that he belongs there anymore because he's thinking all the other cars are younger than him and beating him at the races, right? And that's kind of feedback that one gets. And that can also work in the health-related behaviors that people experience. Like, and you can see this also in some very tragic cases where people in the United States who are Black were questioned for, bird watching in Central Park, or running, in the streets of their hometown, leading to potentially violence and confrontation. And that question of, do I belong there? Like, do I belong in the great outdoors, which is really critical now in the time of COVID, will affect your behavior. Is meditation and yoga only for people with a certain income and certain body mass index? Like, those are why, having fashion that makes everyone be able to go to the gym is important, and that how the stereotype that is very insidious. It can be where, I think I heard, I need to pull up this data, that the challenge can be as simple as telling you, people tend to, of your age don't tend to do well on this test, or it can be very insidious and affect, this is an experimental situation, can affect the outcome, or it can be something like, are you gonna be okay? Your age, like even the more subtle pieces where you just bring up someone's age can often start that piece going. And then that's the interpersonal intersecting with institutional, intersecting with the self-perception. So I think the work that the work on race, the ageism that you and many others are doing is a critical first step.
Yeah, look, and I acknowledge the work that AARP has done, and also the book Disrupt Ageism, because we often talked about, well, 40 is the new 75. But, I really like the way 75 is the new 75. My last comment before we go to Peter is around this fashion. And it just struck me that we not only have clothes that clothe us, but we have images. So this personal image that we wear. Speaking, you put on a different hat, but I think we also need to sort of take some responsibility about what clothing are we wearing, when we start advocating to combat ageism. I think it's a really fascinating topic, and thank you for introducing that. I now will go on to Peter. I'm sorry, Peter, I just got wrapped up in talking with Erwin. So Peter Rundlett, as Vice President of AARP, Peter develops and executes AARP's international strategy to position this great organisation as a global thought leader on ageing. Before joining the organisation, Peter served as the Director of International Strategy for the Obama Foundation, and before that, as Deputy Staff Secretary, for President Obama. He was also the Vice President of the International Policy at the Centre for the American Progress, and he served as counsel for the 9/11 Commission, as Associate Counsel to President Clinton, and as Assistant Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defence and Educational Fund. He started his career as Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras. So Peter, you really have brought such a rich body of life experiences to the position that you have at AARP. And I can remember the very first days that you're coming into AARP, and we had this wide-ranging discussion. And now it's probably, 2 or 3 years has gone by. So it'll be interesting to hear your perspectives and how AARP is really tackling structural ageism, within your unit and more broadly. So thank you for being with us today, Peter.
Well, thank you for having me, Jane. I could have sat and listened to you and everyone go back and forth for the rest of the hour, and I hope we can get back to that pretty quickly. Yes, I've been a big fan of yours since I first started, and really we learned so much from IFA. I'm so grateful for your existence and kind of ongoing engagement in these dialogues. I started at AARP right before COVID hit, and we went home soon after that, where I was forced to learn this great institution and all the issues that we work on from the comfort of my house, which had undergone a flood right before this all happened. But I've come a ways. You went over my bio, and you'll see in that, I hope, a thread, genuine interest in social justice issues and human rights issues. And it's something that I've tried to bring to bear in my work here with the fantastic team at AARP, looking at the human rights of older people, looking at age discrimination, looking at ageism. I was going to, and I'll do this quickly because I know your audience is well versed in the issues of ageism. I was going to do a kind of a quick run through of some of the basics that have come up in the course of the conversation. I mean, we know that ageism is everywhere, right? It affects everyone, regardless of income, where we live, our gender, our race, sexuality, or any other identity we may experience. It seems to surround us in our culture. And you mentioned the global report on ageism that was done, I guess, primarily under the leadership of the World Health Organization, but in partnership with others. In that report, which anyone who's interested in ageism should take a look at, they found that 1 in 2 people are ageist against older people, which is a lot of people on the one hand. On the other hand, I wonder, like, how is 1 in 2 not ageist based on what we see, at least at some level? I feel like we have been trained from our earliest ages to adopt stereotypes, prejudices, and outlooks about older people. We joke about it, it's part of our culture in this country, and we've come to learn that it's very common around the world. So I suppose there's some hope that only 1 in 2 of us are ageist. According to the global report, they broke down ageism into 3 forms: stereotypes, or how we think, prejudice, and how we feel, and discrimination, how we act. And we've already touched on in this conversation that ageism exists at many levels, right? It's, maybe most importantly, there's a structural, systemic, institutional level, right? This meta level that we in which we live. Kind of related to that, and just underneath that, I think, is the societal or cultural signals around ageism that we have. And then finally, it's self-directed, it's personal, it's interpersonal, and it's personal because it's so easy to internalize the everyday ageism that we all experience, from the earliest days in our lives. Of all the isms that we care about, I think ageism is still the least recognized and maybe the most tacitly normalized. It's a form of stereotyping and prejudice that we see in our society. And as we get toward the end of this conversation, as we open it up, I really want to push us to understand that better and understand what we can do about it, how we can break through and remove this, because it's puzzling, because if we're lucky, we will grow old, all of us, and then we will end up suffering from ageism if we don't make any change. And we've joked about whether 60 is the new 40 or 75 is the new 40. I like Joanne's statement that 50 is the new 50. These comments get made because we are living longer, we are living better, healthier lives. Not everybody, but there's a trend in that direction. And yet ageism has not only persisted, it's gotten worse. In AARP's most recent survey of older adults to better understand what kind of discrimination they were facing in employment, nearly 80% of older employees now report that age discrimination is in the workplace. And this is the highest share that has reported this since we first started asking the question in 2003. So that's alarming. Our awareness is growing, and yet the problem is getting worse. Structural ageism. We see it in healthcare delivery, and that's come up a bit already. We see it in employment, which I mentioned. We also see it in the design of our cities, our systems of public transport, and really kind of throughout our society. Perhaps the most shocking of these structural forms of ageism is the ageism in the healthcare system, because we see that procedures and treatments that are routinely delivered to younger people are just as routinely denied to older adults. In one landmark study that I read of 9,000 hospitalized patients, they showed that, and this study was conducted before the pandemic, but healthcare professionals were significantly more likely to withhold life-sustaining treatments for older people, even after controlling for prognosis and patient preferences. So we have to step back from this and realize that 9,000 instances, these are real people, it's impacting real lives. We can get caught up in the enormity of the statistics sometimes around ageism and forget that people are losing jobs, people are being denied access to healthcare that they deserve, people we know and love are being hurt by this. In addition to that, ageism has compound effects. One recent study that was published in the Gerontologist found that when older adults internalize the ageist stereotype or believe it to be true, they have more actual health problems. So it actually increases the health problems due to due to ageism. And these health problems lead to increased spending. One study found that the one-year cost of ageism was $63 billion. And so it's not only a cost to the individual, it's a cost to society. We look at structural racism, or I'm sorry, ageism in employment. The AARP, working with the Economist Intelligence Unit, did something called the Longevity Economy Outlook. And in that, they looked at the economic contribution of people 50 and older in the United States. And they were focusing on 2018. They determined that the economic contribution of the 50 plus population that year was $8.3 trillion. And so 56% of every dollar spent in the United States is spent by people 50 and older. And yet, we see these images that come out in our commercials, the marketing industry, that shows older people being passive in healthcare settings, not doing very much, not leading the sort of nuanced lives that we know that they lead. So it's rife in our culture. We did with the Economist Intelligence Unit, we also did a study on the cost of age discrimination. Basically, they wanted to understand what the cost of it is, and so they looked at the impact of age discrimination on the 50 plus population and measured what what additional GDP the U.S. economy would have had if you could remove all of age discrimination. And they determined, and this was in 2019, that would add an additional $850 billion worth of GDP to our economy. So these are real numbers, huge impacts. We see it at lots of levels in the healthcare industry, in our economy. We see it in our culture through the marketing. And at AARP, we're trying to address all of these things in different ways. But the question does come down to, what can we do about it? For those of you who have read the Global Ageism Report, they really anchor on 3 evidence-based approaches. One is policy and law. What policies and laws can support and protect the rights of older people. They've looked at educational activities, the importance of transmitting knowledge and information to help enhance empathy, to help give people a better understanding of what older people are facing. And then they look at intergenerational engagement. There's been a number of studies showing that when older people and younger people live or interact together, work together, there's greater empathy, greater understanding, and so you reduce some of that natural ageism that comes up. So those are kind of 3 evidence-based recommendations they make, but I think it also behooves us to push a little harder. What kind of interactions we have in our day-to-day life. First, we need to examine it in ourselves, right? We need to confront our own biases and blind spots to make sure that not only are we making jokes about ourselves, but being really thoughtful in what assumptions we're making about other people. And in some sense, it requires us to be really rigorous. There's a kind of a conversation going on in the racism world or anti-racism world about how to be an anti-racist. And it really does require you not just to be colorblind, but quite conscious of race so that you have the right response to it. And in many ways, we need to do the same thing around ageism. We need to actively resist the idea that older people do not contribute to society. We know that's patently wrong. The Longevity Economy Report proved that. Whether it's through their work, through mentoring, volunteering, caregiving, older people are contributing. This notion of being frail or outside and in constant need of help is just that is a small segment of people 50 and older. So we need to constantly be on the lookout for that. We need more research on the effectiveness of some of these anti-ageism interventions. Again, I do think of the isms, this is a unique one. Unlike, I can be a man and say I care about women and gender issues, and I do. I can be a white man and care about other races. Ageism is something, like I said, if you live a long time, you will suffer from it. So it's almost like this early bias against yourself. And so it'd be good to better understand why that is and how we can sort through those stereotypes. I think the research also needs to take us to a place where we can better measure the prevalence of ageism to get a deeper handle on it. The Global Ageism Report was a great start, but like lots of research projects in policy areas, the answer is more research. We do need to do that a little bit. But I think at a systemic level, we can work to build age-friendly cities and communities that offer integrated healthcare, long-term services. We can look for age-friendly workplaces and One of the benefits of COVID is it's shown us what's possible in terms of flexible work schedules, asynchronous work schedules, so that older people can contribute if they have limitations about working a 9-to-5, 40-hour work week. We need to talk about ageism. We need to talk about it in the workplace. We need to talk about it everywhere we go. And we need to train people to be more sensitized to it and to be more affirmatively inclusive about older people. And this is probably most important with respect to training our healthcare providers to make sure that they deliver more individualized, age-specific, integrated care that incorporates the patient's person-centric goals. Our media needs to do a better job. We need more nuanced, diverse portrayals. AARP has had a 3-year partnership with Getty Pictures to make sure that there are lots of stock images available of older people doing things that break these stereotypes. I learned the other day that the ASA has also got a partnership with Shutterstock, which is terrific. We need this sort of kind of nuanced approach to changing the outlook on ageism. And at the end of the day, it kind of begins and ends with us. We've been culturally trained our whole lives to be ageist. And so we now need to be critically reflexive about our own views and constantly challenge the unconscious biases of others. So I'll stop there. I do want our conversation to go in the direction of solutions and what we can do about this. We're at a critical moment in time with this possible issues of multi-generational warfare or conflict, and it's in everyone's interest to reduce ageism and get this right. So,
Peter, that's such a rich discussion that you've started. We've got to consciously address the unconscious bias, and it starts with us. I think each of the 3 speakers today, Patrick, Erwin, and Peter, have really created, this body of information that we need to be immersed in, information to action. I do want to ask a question, 2 questions, one from Katrina Bizanis and one from Cynthia Stewart. And I'll start with that from Cynthia. Patrick, Erwin, and Peter have done a great job, but as men in this space, how can each of them feel they can impact the multiple jeopardies faced by older women? Do you feel you have a greater responsibility to address this? So who would like to kick that response off? And what a great question. Peter.
I'll jump in to say that to validate the question, right? You have 3 men here. I think, Jen, you started at the beginning by letting us know that we had, unfortunately, a panelist who was ill at the lesson and dropped out. So just to make sure that I'm defending Jane's work in putting together the panel, I will fall short in representing the views of older women. We need older women's voices to speak for themselves. I will say at AARP, and Erica Dar is on our team, and I know listening to this now, we're very focused on this. We understand the intersectional nature of age and gender. Erica led a terrific discussion at the UN earlier this year, and it's a body of work that we're going to be carrying out, not just throughout the year, but going forward. We know that older women face multitudes of multiple layers of discrimination that makes everything worse. When they have to drop out of the workforce, they have lower pensions. When they have to be caregivers, they have lower pensions. So in answer to Cynthia's question, we care deeply about these questions and we're paying attention to them. But it's unfortunate that we don't have more women on this panel to speak about that directly.
And I think just to speak to that, as an older woman, I can say I want to assume a place at the table because of my expertise, not because I'm an older woman. And I think that we've actually almost gone down this path of, okay, who needs to be at the table? Oh, we don't have gender balance. That's irrelevant, if we don't have the right expertise at the table. So there's got to be this real balance going on. I just want to go to Erwin or Patrick, if you want to make any comments on that. Otherwise, I'm going to go to another question.
I think aging is also a women's issue, just because the majority of women live longer than men, have lower mortality rates at every age group, and yet there's the economic, which just fully compounds the systemic economic disparities and discrimination that occurs at every age group. So I think that's it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd come in and echo Peter. I think he made a really important point about pensions specifically. And ILC, we did a piece of research looking at the retirement prospects of people in Generation X, so those aged, born between 1965 and 1980. And one of the things we found is that women are disproportionately affected and less likely to have bigger pensions or as big a pensions as men. And other research by, I think it was Scottish Widows in the UK, showed there's a huge pension gap in the UK. It's about £100,000 difference between men and women when they come to retirement in private pension savings. And this is due to those factors such as, taking career breaks, but also as well becoming sandwich carers, which affects both men and women. But we interviewed people and did surveys and found that women are more likely to be in caring roles or taking career breaks, and that really does impact them at later life when they come to retire. So this is something I think the way we can respond is by doing this in-depth research, this qualitative and quantitative analysis of the problem, and really portraying that to policymakers and making sure that people do not, as we titled the report, slip between the cracks.
I think the real challenge is that sometimes, even if we have an abundance of evidence, political will is just not there. And that's why organisations such as ILC and AARP, we do influence and help shape policy. So I'd like to go to a question from Katrina Bouzanis from the IFA. The negative narrative about the economic impact of the upside down demographic pyramid is still perpetuated by media. Most recently, a few days ago, there was a TV session dedicated to this topic in Toronto. Could speakers comment on the impact of media's portrayal of ageing populations and what might be needed to shift the perspective to a more positive, or in my mind, a more realistic one? So I'm going to kick off with Patrick and then go to Erwin and then Peter.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this. It's a great question. I think I mentioned this in my discussion there, actually, about, in the media, there's obviously ageist advertisement and marketing that really doesn't, it kind of draws on those ideas of what we think an older person is without actually, showcasing that there is a lot of economic value. And I think Peter mentioned it in his discussion about, American consumers. We also found similarly that a large proportion of spending is by older consumers, but that doesn't mean that you have to be ageist in your approach when it comes to advertising and trying to draw on those consumers. And I think the way you get to the answer, you get to the bottom of this, and you try to answer is by really trying to, bring it home with these big punchy stats like I've got here, like in our report on health equals wealth. In 2015, spending by older households in the G20 averaged 22% of GDP. That amounts to almost $10 trillion US, and that's more than the combined GDPs of Japan, Australia, Canada, and Brazil. So that's a huge economic contribution by older people, but really not trying to draw upon older people in the media and stuff and portraying them as one kind of person, actually encouraging older people and making it clear that they offer and there is large economic value in older people is key. And I think, again, our research and trying to make this clear to policymakers and to economic stakeholders is going to be fundamental if we want to bring about systemic change.
Okay, thank you. Erwin, then Peter, and then we'll start wrapping up. So Erwin, your comment? Need to go unmute.
Has to happen at least once. So I'm assuming the upside down pyramid, meaning sort of like the decreased birth rates, higher percentage of people in the older population. I think that one of the papers that I recently worked on with my colleagues at ARP around the longevity economy talks about, what if people actually could live longer? What would the benefit be for that? And not just longer, what if we could have equity, right? And if we could have equity, the annual economic benefit to the United States would be cumulatively, if we had equity now, meaning all people from different racial groups could live as long as the best, as long as the group that's living the longest, we could have 1.6 trillion more in the US economy cumulatively from now until 2030. So I think the question is which relates to the longevity economy outlook proposal that that living longer is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that could also, I think, benefit everyone. And I think where we do find this question of intergenerational conflict is when we talk about this idea of a zero-sum game, where we talk about it's us versus them. Well, instead of talking about more about a growth perspective, that we have different roles. Jane, you said that, when I said 50 is the new 50, you said the first 50 does actually matter, right? And we know from Laura Carstensen that the socio-selective model, as one ages, one's horizons changes and what one does changes, and potentially one's roles can change. So if you do find yourself in an intergenerational situation with a child who is at least 6 years or older, I would recommend you see this movie, Cars 3. It really does talk. It's just more of a tongue in cheek, but it talks about sort of the life course of a character who was first presented as a sort of a cocky upstart race car, and then achieves, spoiler alert, through this third movie, the role of a mentor, right? And so I think that in elevating these benefits, and in the experience core, that was the other piece, an ARP Foundation program where we place older volunteers in public schools. It was good for the older adults in that for the men, they had, as opposed to control, it was a randomized control study, the men had sustained a slightly larger hippocampal volume as opposed to controls. Hippocampus, the area of the brain that encodes the memories. And the women sort of had increased walking as measured by step counters, and also social interactions, right? But they had an opportunity to express this. So we as a society have to take advantage of this new age pyramid and use these resources. And the children who also had less behavioral issues also benefited. So I think that it's a narrative. So we have evidence-based research, we need a narrative, and we need a constituency, and you all are the constituency. So I think that's the three pieces of any successful policy: the evidence basis, the narrative, and the coalition.
Okay, thank you, Erwin. Your comment, Peter? Unmute.
I agree with everything Erwin just said. I think one thing to point out, or maybe to underscore, is we look at this question of the longevity economy and where the money is. We thought when we did the research, it was important to let the world know where the productive value was, where the money was. We wanted to shift the focus of marketers to where the money is, but we recognized in doing that there was danger of creating a little bit more of intergenerational conflict. This sort of notion that we have the money, we the older people have the money, and that's really not the point. We do not want to create that sort of zero-sum approach. And so I think that's something to look out for as we create solutions. Really, we're in this together, young and old, and young people have a stake in getting rid of ageism because they're related to older people. They will become older people. Older people want to be productive and engaged. We want to make the world better for all, including young people. And so just want to call out that dynamic that as we try to lift up older people, we also want to be mindful that we're not creating a dynamic of us versus them. We really want to move away from that.
Now, I think it's very important, Peter. Thank you. I'm going to go back to each speaker now just for one takeaway. Patrick, what's your takeaway message today?
Well, for me, it's got to be health equals wealth. If we can ensure people are in better health at older life, you can ensure that they'll be able to contribute more to the economy, but also as well, that goes in hand with the social the social barriers, which is obviously structural ageism. They need to break this down in order to achieve that. And just on Peter's point, I think he made a really interesting point earlier about, we talk about racism and sexism, but we never talk about ageism as a proper issue. And until we really classify this as something that is just as demeaning and something that's disrespectful as those other controversies, then we need to really, we won't be able to achieve this.
And of course, people are dying because of ageism. Yeah. So, Erwin, your takeaway message.
Actually, it's a pitch for a preview. ARP is the sponsor of the National Academy of Medicine's Global Roadmap for Health Longevity, which we released a consensus report in early June. I'm looking forward to that because I do believe it addresses this issue, both the physical and social space. But I think that, again, I really appreciate the need for evidence-based policy, this narrative that it's not a zero-sum game, that we all have something to gain across all generations. and trying to mobilize the coalition that IFA represents, I think, is the key part.
So, Erwin, whatever you need, we will support. So thank you. And Peter, you have the final takeaway message.
I guess where I want to end on this is coming back to the need for a real focus on solutions. I mean, I know that, you know, I work in a place where we talk about ageism every day. I think probably you do as well, Jane and Patrick. I'm guessing a lot of people who took the time to listen to the session are also very aware of the issue. It's a complicated issue. I think that it really is going to require, of course, it requires legal and policy change, and we are working on that. And I haven't talked about the work we're doing there because oftentimes the law does set the norm. But I think just as we need to call out gender when it shows up as an issue, and as I appreciate it was raised why we only have 3 men talking about this. We need to call out racism. We need to call out everyday ageism, which has become, it's so acceptable. We learned that in several languages the word ageism doesn't even exist because, and I think that's presumably because it's not an issue. It's not a problem. Not that it's not an issue. No one has a problem with it, and we should have a problem with it. And we need to call it out at every turn.
Do you know, you've made a really important point. It is a problem and we need to call it out. And so thank you for ending on that note. You know, over the past few weeks, the IFA has had the profound pleasure of partnering with AARP to deliver some of the most outstanding webinars I've had the pleasure to moderate. So I want to take this opportunity as we close this, our final webinar, where we've tried to address structural ageism to unlock the longevity economy, to thank AARP, Peter, thank you, Erwin, and all the speakers from AARP, of which there are many, and most particularly, you know, colleague and friend Erica Dar. In closing, this is not the end of our conversation on structural ageism and how to combat it. You know, AARP is dedicated to this particular area, one of the action areas of the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. So you can certainly count on us, Peter, for support, but also promoting and disseminating this important work, you know, and Erwin rightly said, you know, we have the evidence, you know, where are the coalitions, evidence policy coalitions, and how can we drive change? And we have the solutions. Some of us have these solutions, you know, to combat ageism. So I thank you very much to AARP, to our speakers today, for Patrick stepping in at the last minute. I hope that Lily, you know, improves. And finally, thank you to Andra Stanku and also to Rashmi Gupta. Andra has led the development of these webinars, you know, adeptly and perfectly as always. So thank you, Andra, for your leadership in these, and also Rashmi for cleaning up my errors if they happen, and also the technology. So be well, stay safe, and we look forward to the next opportunity to be with you through partnerships with AARP and many others. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.